to welcome you to the fourth session of the Integrated Weed Management for Women on Farms. This is brought to you by Southern Farming Systems with support from Glenelg, Hopkins, Catchment Management Authority with funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. I'm Michelle McClure from Southern Farming Systems, and one of my roles in Southern Farming Systems is to coordinate the Women on Farms program. Today, our presenter is Jess Brogden from Southern Farming Systems. Jess was appointed to Southern Farming Systems in 2017 as a part of the graduate MLA Livestock Consulting Internship program. Jess has stayed on working with us as a research and extension officer in our soils and pastures team, being mentored by Lisa Miller and Cam Nicholson. Jess's current projects that she's been working on consist of pasture persistence, subclover and weeds in the feed base. Jess will be covering the topic of competitive pastures today. So I'd like to just hand over to Jess now.
Thank you so much to everyone for making themselves available for today's webinar. I hope that everyone can walk away with a couple of tactics to apply to your pasture systems, and I'll kick off with a quick overview of what we'll cover. Okay, so we're going to be looking at 4 factors in regards to building up a competitive perennial pasture base. So the first is looking at soil fertility and how fertility can help remove our weeds by producing fatter leaves, longer, bigger crowns in our perennial grasses where they outcompete them. We'll then be looking at how to manage our perennial grass swards. So the 4 plants that we focus on is Phalaris, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass and cocksfoot. And each of those differs from each other in terms of how to best manage them. From there, we'll be looking at plants that complement that grass swards. We'll be looking at subclover management in particular, and looking at key management factors over 3 seasons and how to get the most out of the plant there. And then sometimes maybe after we assess our paddocks, we might find that they're just thinning out, and there could be opportunities to oversow with a competitive complementary pasture base. So we'll look at a few tactics there. And the idea is that these 4 factors really help drive a competitive perennial pasture as a tactic for our integrated weed management. So that's the goal of today. All right, so I'm going to introduce my poster boy for today's presentation. This is Sean the sheep, and I'm really just want to throw it over to you guys, and Michelle's going to help me out here. I'd love you to utilize your chat boxes and just write down a couple of words that come to mind when you think soil fertility, and I'll just get Michelle to call them out as they come through. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Are we getting any words, Shell?
They're coming through. Nitrogen, carbon,
yep.
Microbes,
yep.
High fertility and low fertility weeds.
Perfect.
Good clover base for nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
High available nutrients. Soil type, phosphorus and lime, and optimizing pasture production and quality indicator species, e.g. weeds, versus pasture species composition. Yep. And pH for overall soil health.
Perfect. All right, so we're definitely all on the same page there, and that's the same thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking soil fertility as well. So what that sort of shows us is there is a lot of factors we need to consider when we're looking at soil fertility. And to kick that off, I just want to explore the origin of plant nutrient deficiencies where they require correction through the application of fertilizer. And this can lie in a number of direct causes. So we can be looking at low native fertility of the soil concern. So that's our parent material. Leaching of nutrients, for example, sulfur in sandy soils. We could be looking at soil erosion where we lose the top few inches of soil. Or the removal of nutrients by harvesting our crops or grazing animals. So those animals are consuming the nutrients through the dry matter production, but then that product's removed. And if we're not topping that up, it's just a depleting bucket over time. So I just really want to start by exploring the laws of minimum when applying fertiliser. And the best way to do that is by looking at Liebig's barrel concept, which is so well illustrated with this little picture here. So the law tells us that nutrients in the least amount, or where it's most deficient, can limit production, or in this case, leak yield from the barrel, as we can see here. So it doesn't matter if you have really high phosphorus and really great nitrogen levels. If the potassium was limiting, then our pastures won't grow well. We'll be really falling short of that ideal yield. Or you can look at it in the concept of a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, okay? But it's also really critical to note that a plant can only take up nutrients if there is adequate abundance of other growth promoting factors. And that's things like water, light, temperature, disease, you know, those kind of things that really impact the growth and leaf emergence of those plants. So the application of one factor or one nutrient alone won't necessarily increase the yields. There are a lot of nutrients and soil conditions that can be limiting, but the big ticket items that cause about 95% of the loss of yields is looking at our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, moly, and soil acidity, particularly in our pasture systems. So working to get these right will really set you up. Okay. So I want to talk to you about another law, which is the law of diminishing returns. Okay, so soil testing tells us where the paddock lies on the graph. Okay. If a soil test result shows that there is not much of a nutrient, then there is a high probability that adding fertiliser will increase the yield. But there does come a point where the probability of a yield increase becomes small enough that the economics of a fertiliser application don't really make sense. And that is known as the critical point. So each nutrient is going to have its own critical point, which is where you get the most performance. Like at that point, you get the most performance from that plant. So as you can see here, for instance, if our critical point was about here, it's a very detailed graph, as you can see. But for example, if our critical point was here, if our soil test showed that the nutrient levels fell short of that critical point, we're going to get a pretty dramatic yield response. But if our nutrient levels indicated that they were just on our critical point or even in excess of our critical point, you can see that we're not really going to get that economical return. So it becomes a decision of, well, maybe it might not be the best use of funds to apply a nutrient that won't give you that yield response. Okay. So if we bring this back to integrated weed management, we can see that soil fertility changes the pasture composition quite significantly. All right, so this example was taken from the Hamilton long-term phosphate experiment and was published in November 2013. This graph describes it really well. So, excuse me. Where we have very low soil fertility, we can see there's an abundance of less productive species. So looking at our native grasses, bent grass, sweet vernal, and onion grass. As the fertility increases, the composition dramatically changes to our in favour of our more productive pasture species. So our phalaris and ryegrass species really start taking a hold. Our subclover increases in abundance. But the backhanded complement of increasing your soil fertility is the emergence of high fertility weeds. Okay, so as you can see here, the presence of cateweed, erodium, our annual grasses like barley grass become a lot more prominent. But this is also a great example of the law of diminishing returns. So as you can see, dramatic yield responses coming up to moderate fertility. But then it comes to a point where you might question the economic viability of applying more fertiliser. And at which point, where we apply high fertiliser, we're actually increasing the presence of capeweed and erodium. Although we can capitalise on the feed value of that through other tactics that Lisa's talked about, we question whether it's, is worth putting on more fertiliser when we're already getting the response from a moderate application. Okay. So sometimes we're given a visual cue that our pastures have fallen short of their critical factors. And we often see this in ryegrass pastures in late winter and spring, where we get these really dense patches of growth sporadically throughout the paddock, okay? And these are actually concentrated on dung and urine patches. And it provides very competitive growth. And the difference in this can be shown by soil tests. So we did soil tests on the dung and urine patches, and about 20 of them in a pretty representative cross-section of the paddock. And then we've done the same in these just control areas between, and massive differences in our nitrogen, our potassium, and our sulfur. So we're getting that visual cue that's showing us that we're falling short and that our pastures are responsive to that, fertilizers coming in the form of dung and urine. Okay, so if we take a representative species from that previous slide, like these ryegrass plants here, and so say this one is from the nutrient response patch, and this is from like the control from the rest of the paddock, we can see that like if these have had 4 weeks rest, they're at the same leaf stage, but massive difference in herbage mass. And the main driver of that is fertility. But it's also really critical to understand that fertility doesn't produce more leaves, okay? A plant is genetically designed to produce a certain number of leaves per tiller. But what fertility does do is make those leaves longer, wider, fatter. And it will likewise create bigger plant crowns, which take up more space. It can take up 30% more space of the pasture. And when you put that across a paddock, that's an enormous amount that it's taking up. And thereby it creates more shading and by default increases the competitiveness of that plant. And you can see the same here with the clover plants, the difference in leaf size, and even here with some phalaris plants. Okay. So again, if we want to get the most out of our fertilizer application, the leaves on our tillers must be given a chance to grow big and fat. Okay, the extra quantity of dry matter will be greater on a pasture that can be spelled compared to one that is as flat as the table you're sitting at. Okay, so it's no wonder we see bigger responses of fertilizer in spring compared to winter, because in spring we've got the benefit of soil moisture and our temperature, which is driving the rate of that leaf emergence, and that leaf's getting more surface area to produce more energy. So if we recall back to our limiting factors and the law of minimum, you can have all the nutrients available to the plant, but if it can't capture sunlight to utilize it, it's not going to be useful. But we'll talk about rest periods in a second. So this graph is a perfect example here of we're seeing how we're capitalizing on that good fertility and it's making an impact on our pasture system. So over summer and winter, you know, it's not too much of a difference, but here in spring, where we've got our most animal demand for pasture, is big difference here. So we're putting a lot of fat in the system, giving us more opportunity to look after our growing animals and our reproductive animals, as opposed to here where our dry matter production is really limited just by poor fertility. Okay, so how did we go with our webinar exercise? I always find IDing plants can go one of two ways. One way, it's like this stick figure here who looks rather pleased with himself, hasn't been hamstrung by any ID factors, or it can turn out a little like doing a mathematical equation for NASA, where it's just really overwhelming and there's just a lot of detail to try and consume. But the reason we did that exercise is that each of our perennial grasses need to be managed slightly different from one another. And that's likewise with the clover. So if we aren't able to identify them, we aren't able to manage them accordingly. And a poorly managed pasture provides an inviting landscape for our weeds. Okay, so now that we've ID'd our pasture, we can look a little bit closer at it. So each plant is a collection of tillers, and each tiller has its own root system and its own growing point. And each tiller, depending on species, only grows a certain number of leaves, which we just mentioned. So for instance, ryegrass will have a maximum number of 3, fescue might have 5, phalaris 4, and cocksfoot can flirt between 5 and 6. But once it has grown that maximum number of leaves, the oldest one dies. So the first leaf is produced and it uses photosynthesis to produce the second leaf, and then at which point it begins replenishing its carbohydrates. So by the time the third leaf is formed, the carbohydrates are fully replenished. So this is using the example of a ryegrass plant where it has 3 leaves. The production of a fourth leaf can often cause shading, and then the first leaf begins to die. So if the first leaf is continuously grazed, then the plant is never able to replenish its carbohydrates and will eventually die. So if we're in here, okay? But if we're grazing at this third leaf stage, where it's replenished its carbohydrates, then we're capitalizing on the growth of that plant before we start losing value and losing unutilized leaves. But there is a balance between encouraging quantity and maintaining quality. So I will explain the redback boots in a second, bear with me. But a perfect example is, say we go out into our paddocks in winter and our paddocks might be quite short, and we look across into our tree break and there's an absolute abundance of dry matter. It's just a bulk of feed that might be, you know, knee, waist high. And it's almost makes you wish that you had that kind of bulk in the paddock. But there is a trade-off. When you're growing that much bulk, components in the plant called like cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin are more prominent as opposed to the highly water-soluble sugary carbohydrates that you see in like spring pastures. And those less desirable components like make it a lot less digestible. And that's what supports the plant getting so tall, is it's more woody, if you will, and gives it that structure, but you're losing the quality. So when we're looking at phase 1, which is about less than 2 centimeters in height, so this is where our redbacks come into play. So the height of our sole here is about 2 centimeters. So it's just a good visual reminder. So where the pasture is about, you know, between 2 centimeters and flat to the boards, pasture growth is really slow because the plants have run out of energy. They don't have that surface leaf area to capitalize on that sunlight and convert it into energy. And we're not going to get the quantity or the recovery of that plant. It's going to take a little bit longer, but we'll cover that in a second. Phase 2 in here, which is between 3 to 10 centimeters in height, and that sort of equates roughly to about the length of our elastic here. Okay. Oh, excuse me. So it's really ideal in this phase because its increased leaf area means it can be a solar panel to that sunlight and create energy. And the pasture growth and quality will be a maximum. So that's between 1,200 to 2,000 kilos. And then phase 3 here is where growth really starts to slow as we get more shading and decay of those leaves that have just met the end of their genetic coding. They're not designed to hold on to more than, say for ryegrass, 3 green leaves, okay? So it's gonna start, decaying off, create a lot of shading for that crown to produce new tillers. So here in phase 2, we are losing a little bit of quality, but we're getting the yield as well. So if we go earlier and we're grazing them in phase 1, yes, it's going to be very high quality, but you're not going to have the quantity. Whereas if we wait a little bit later, you're going to have more quantity, but you're going to be losing quality. So you might be running dry stock steers or wethers in phase 3, whereas in phase 2, this is where you'll be running your highly productive animals, like your reproductive animals and your growing animals. Okay. So when we talked about rest periods just before, this is it in a little bit more detail. So we have our 4 species of focus here, and then our target grazing leaf stage. And as we can see, the rest periods are very similar. Well, they're all the same. So in autumn and winter, we're going to have the moisture, which is very important, but you're not going to have the temperature. So it's just going to slow down the rate at which those leaves emerge. They're going to emerge, it's just going to be a little bit longer. Whereas in spring, you've got the best of both worlds. You have the temperature and you have the soil moisture, and those leaves are going to be firing, are going to be emerging at much faster rates. Another very clever survival strategy of perennial grasses, particularly over the summer, is through dormant buds, daughter tillers, and seedling recruitment. Okay, so for cocksfoot and perennial ryegrass, they'll utilise daughter tillers and seedling recruitment. And so daughter tiller, for instance, is where there is a bud below the crown of the plant and it emerges into a tiller as part of that plant. So if you can imagine a crown and it's producing these tillers, it's going to get wider and wider and wider. And one of these plants can occupy a further 30%. So if you think of that in a competitive nature, that's occupying a lot more space, and it's going to be a lot harder for our weeds to get a foothold. When we're talking about seedling recruitment, for instance, it's looking at that perennial ryegrass and that cocksfoot running to head, producing seed, and then that seed falls to the ground, produces a new plant. That won't work for phalaris, okay? So those of us that have phalaris in our grazing systems will know that once it's established and mature, it's one of the most resilient and drought-tolerant plants we can put in. But it is absolutely hopeless as a seedling. So really have to nurture it through that. So what phalaris relies on for its persistence is the setting out of dormant buds, okay? And that happens through the process of stem elongation. So that's when it's running to head. Now, the further a phalaris plant can go through the process of stem elongation, the more dormant buds it lays down, okay? And the more dormant buds it lays down, the better chance it has to survive over the summer without responding to summer rainfall. Okay, so Sean the sheep and I are putting it back over to you guys again. And same system, I was going to get Michelle to call out some words and phrases of why you think clovers are important to our perennial pasture systems. Now, I don't mind if you approach this from the direction of the impact of clovers for animal production, or if you approach it from the direction of impact of clovers on our livestock production. So I'll just give you a minute to do that, and I'll get Michelle to call them out as they come through.
All that coming in thick and fast. Everyone's on the ball. So adding nitrogen to the soil because they fix nitrogen. They're high in feed quality. It fixes nitrogen, which helps the grasses tiller. Mainly the good old fixing of nitrogen, which is exactly what they do for us.
Perfect. All right, we are all on the same page. That is great. So that's exactly what I'm thinking as soon as I hear legumes, clovers. So nitrogen, as someone just mentioned, spot on. Nitrogen is critical for new tillers to form on our perennial grasses. And we're using our clovers to bring that nitrogen into the system. But to get subclover into the system, you need phosphorus. So you can see how all these elements are interlinked, producing a productive competitive pasture. And as a lot of people have already alluded to, the clovers are the engine room of our perennial pasture systems. Okay, I'm a little bit biased. I absolutely love clover. But in terms of animal performance, in terms of animal performance, as the legume content increases, so does the livestock performance. So they're highly digestible, so they move through the rumen much quicker than our grasses. And so animals are able to consume and process more and lay that down as building blocks for growth, okay? In terms of pasture production, clovers add nitrogen to the soil by a symbiosis relationship with the rhizobia bacteria, which people have already mentioned, which is awesome. And they fix that atmospheric nitrogen, convert it into a plant available nitrogen. And when that plant dies off, it releases it for the grass sward to utilize, therefore providing a critical nutrient for the growth of our plant, which then enhances the competitive nature of our pasture. So we want to maintain a composition of about 30 to 40%, which puts us in this range here. Okay, that allows for a sufficient supply of nitrogen to the grass sward, increasing feed quality, animal performance, and thereby presenting itself as a productive gap filler, okay, between the grass swards, reducing the ability of weeds to get a foothold. So when we're looking at management, we'll kick things off by looking at managing them in the winter. We know that leaf production is directly related to grazing. Okay, frequent hard grazing down to about 800 kilos or less than 2 centimeters. So remembering the height of the rubber sole on your redbacks. Over winter and early spring increases seed production because it increases the number of leaves on each subclover runner. Okay, each time the plant is grazed, new leaves are produced on the runner, creating a potential site for a new flower. So a perfect example is when we're mowing our lawns over winter and early spring. We don't really notice too much about the composition because it's all just green. So we keep on mowing it, looks fabulous. Then come late winter, we've just suddenly grown a white carpet. And that's just because we're creating an environment that favours the production of subclover. So the research has shown us that 90% of the variation in our seed yield is directly related to our dry matter production. More leaves, more seed yield. Okay, this, with our management of subclover, is not exactly ideal for our grasses. So be strategic. If we're looking at a paddock maybe that's 10% clover, you know, we might choose management tactics that really nurture that subclover development, but it's going to hurt the grasses. So maybe the grasses take a back seat in 2020 and we pick up again in 2021. So you've just got to be strategic in which paddocks you're preferentially going to manage. But if you manage your pastures, if you've got a good composition, if you just manage them between 1,500 to 2,000 kilos of dry matter, it's going to be a good balance for both. Okay, just to make sure you're all still with me, I was going to throw a pop quiz your way. And Michelle, if you can let me know when everyone's answered, how many seeds do you think that one subclover plant can produce?
Certainly can do that for you.
Thank you.
C, 100.
Yep.
These ladies are all on the ball. They're all going for the 100.
Yes, excellent.
They have been listening.
I think they're all over it. Well, those ladies would be absolutely 100% correct. So high quantities of subclover seed set in any 1 year are possible. Okay, a pasture containing that 30 to 40%, which is desirable, would have relied on 200 to 300 kilos a hectare of seed, which is just awesome. How it's achieved this is that each subclover plant will have about 5 runners with about 6 spurs, and each containing 3 to 4 large seeds per runner. Okay, so a spelled plant can produce over 100 seeds, and this becomes part of the subclover seed bank in the soil. So you're all over it. And we want seed set to occur because we either are relying on an established seed bank from years prior, or we need to set seed each year just because it's an annual plant and that seed bank might not have been built up as much as we want. So when we're managing in the spring, at flowering, grazing pressure should be reduced but not removed. So our subclover leaves still need to capture light to create energy to fuel the growing seed, much of the same concept with our grasses needing that surface area. It also means that the plant needs to maintain that leaf. Okay, so this can be a bit of a difficult balancing act, as very carefully illustrated by my balancing giraffe. Lax grazing will tend to favour the grasses, which in turn can shade out the subclover, but excessive grazing after flowering may remove the flowers, therefore the burrs and your seed. The target, I think, should be trying to keep dry matter at or below that 2,000 kilos, so just below the top of the elastic of your redbacks. And simply just reducing the grazing over spring will be suffice. You can still capitalise and utilise that high value feed, but just reduce the grazing pressure. Okay, we're moving into our summer management. Subclover is exceptionally clever in that it has 2 mechanisms that prevent all the seed that is set in any 1 year from germinating on false breaks and ensuring seed reserves carry through drought conditions, poor springs. And these are hard-seededness, which stops the seed absorbing water, and embryo dormancy, which stops the seed germinating, even though the seed is wet. At the end of flowering, subclover typically has about 90% hard seed, but this does decline over summer. And this hard-seeded breakdown is largely governed by summer temperatures fluctuating on the soil surface, in particular our day and night temperatures. So what we know is that dry material insulates the soil, which reduces the fluctuation in temperature. And it can actually reduce it by as much as 6 degrees. So if you've got, like, say, 6 tonne of dry matter, a difference in 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, but it's absolutely dramatic. So if we look at our graph here, this excessive trash simulated about 6 tonne of dry matter per hectare. And as we can see, it's really inhibited the subclover germination. We've done another scenario where we reduced all standing and residual dry matter. It was just bare ground. So we can see that we've still had a germination, but when we compare it to reducing the dry matter to 1,000 to 2,000 kilos, we have maximised the germination without imposing environmental risks such as erosion, and it hasn't been predated on like the bare ground may have. So an example of that might be if you notice after drought conditions, for instance, you might get, when the drought breaks, an abundance of clover germinating. It's because that bare ground has had unlimited exposure to fluctuating soil surface temperatures. And so we see it in that example. Okay. So we might find that after we go into our paddocks and make our assessments, we might see that our pastures are thinning out, maybe to a point where it's inviting weeds into the feed base. Now, there are some really valuable options in oversowing to lift the competition, particularly oversowing with ryegrass and subclover, where there isn't much competition, can be a really good option. But in these situations, it's really important to first see why the original pasture base started throwing in the towel. It's really expensive to renovate our pastures, so we want to make sure that history isn't repeating itself. So it might mean that we revisit or undertake a look at the paddock history, soil fertility, soil conditions. So we're looking at pH, acidicity, salinity, seeing if disease and pest in the previous pasture was inhibiting it, looking at rainfall, grazing management, and even if the species that was sown was tolerant of waterlogging or even drought conditions. And, you know, when we look into our cultivars, like each cultivar presents its own benefits and limitations. So for instance, Phalaris is very drought tolerant. It's really deep rooted and produces these dormant buds that get it from summer to summer. And it gives it a lot more protection from overgrazing in tough times because of those dormant buds. On the contrary, with perennial ryegrass, there you get an enormous choice of maturity and heading dates. So you can tailor, depending on your own grazing and farming system, how long that plant is vegetative for, where you're getting the quality for those highly productive animals. And just seeing where they're suited in terms of your rainfall in case the season cuts out early. For example, you know, Base, which is a ryegrass variety, was in a trial near Hamilton, and it found that it presented greater persistence because its crown was actually buried further under the soil surface, and it made it really difficult for sheep to eat into that crown, so increasing its longevity in terms of persistence. In the Pasture Paramedic manual, the technical manual, it offers great tactics and strategies when considering looking into manipulating our pasture base. That's a great resource as well. And also the MLA's Pasture Trial Network is a great resource. So when we're looking at managing our pastures, we have so many factors out of our control. I mean, we're looking at climate variability, topography, parent rock material that actually underlies our entire fertiliser approach. But then we have a lot of factors that are within our control. So we have soil fertility, perennial grass management, our subclover management, our species selection. And when we incorporate these into a systems approach, you know, we're producing a competitive perennial pasture that can help increase our tactics and strategies for our integrated weed management. We do have to understand and appreciate, though, the backhanded compliment that comes with increasing our soil fertility. It will provide favourable conditions for our high fertility weeds like barley grass and capeweed, but these same conditions also favour our perennial pastures. And when we manage grazing and rest periods, we're actually creating less space for our weeds to invade and just adding another tactic and another tool to our integrated weed management program. So I'll open the floor up to questions, feedback, whatever you guys, if you need resources, it's up to you guys.